evening and welcome to Out of This World. Last week we had an overwhelming response to our luck questionnaire. Thank you to everyone who took part. We received nearly 1 million phone calls and we are sorry if you couldn't get through on the night. We'll give you the results in a couple of weeks' time. On tonight's programme, a unique experiment to find out if we know when we're being secretly watched. We have the story of a mother and daughter who say they've been on board an alien spacecraft, and the strange case of the security guard who believes he came face to face with himself. But first tonight, here's Choi.
Have a listen to this tape. Those sounds, an organ playing, a knock, chains rattling, are said to come from the walls of an old pub in Kenfig, Mid Glamorgan. What's more, when they were recorded, the room was apparently empty. So how is it that, as some people claim, noises from the past can be recorded in the present?
The trail begins here at Kenfig and the Prince of Wales Public House. The first place to turn for information is the local guidebooks. They show this building has a powerful connection with the past. From the 1600s, it was a courtroom. Local legend has it that condemned men were hanged just down the road and then buried somewhere close to here. Nowadays, it's a pub, and inside, they say that the noise of voices and music continues even when the place is empty, and they say they have the tapes to prove it. I need to find out how those recordings came about. The publican here is Mick Evans.
About 3 years after we came to live at this pub, we were in this room on a Sunday evening, having just finished, and I was sitting over there reading the newspaper, and my wife had the television, must have been quietly, when we both looked at one another, and because we heard organ music. And through the adjacent wall, there was an organ, or a harmonium, in the Sunday school, and it was playing audibly. So I went to investigate with the two dogs. And as I was approaching the top of the stairs, the music was still playing. And to my surprise, the door was still intact and not been broken into as I thought. So I put the key in, opened the door, and the room was in darkness. And as I opened the door, the organ music stopped playing.
And there was nobody there?
There was nobody there at all.
The story intrigued two pub regulars, an electrical engineer and an industrial chemist. They decided to investigate.
We reasoned that possibly the noises were actually coming from the fabric of the building. So we then decided to take a sample of the stones that the building is made out of, and we found that they contained silica and a percentage of ferric oxide, the very things that are in microchips and recording tapes. So what we've reasoned is that possibly the walls were acting as a low-grade, primitive recording medium.
So what next?
Well, when I heard about Alan's analysis, we discussed it in this room actually, and the suggestion was that we'd inject the wall with electricity so to release these sounds and noises that people had heard in this inn.
Well, we very simply drove the electrodes...
Alan and John showed me how they passed an electric current through two nails hammered into the wall, then set up a microphone and tape machine, time to start recording at 1 a.m. The room was locked. When they returned the next day, this is what they heard. So what would you say to people who would say, come on, this is just a pub prank?
Well, it's understandable that people are sceptical of our claims, but we were sincere.
We've come under a lot of ridicule, but as John said, there's something going on, a phenomena which we can't understand.
We've decided to try our own experiment, so I've called in Roger Waldron, a sound recordist with 12 years' experience at the BBC. You're the sound engineer we're pinning all our hopes on. What have you got planned?
I've been able to get hold of John's original tape recorder, which we're going to set up in the room tonight, in the way that John and Alan set it up. And in addition to that, I've got a digital recorder, which I'm going to set up with a contact microphone in one channel, which will be attached to the wall and pick up any sounds from the wall, and an open microphone in the other, in the room, in case we're getting noises within the room. And then I'll be setting up downstairs, cabling the microphones back through the window and staying up in the pub all night.
So you're staying downstairs to monitor all the sounds?
That's right, yes.
Now, how are you going to make sure there's no hoaxing or anything like that?
That is a thought. So to try and overcome that problem, I've got some specialised security equipment, which is a sort of remotely operated movement sensor. And if there's any movement, these will trigger an alarm downstairs in the room where I hopefully are still awake.
Well, I'm leaving, Roger, to set up the rest of the gear, because the people that made those original recordings mentioned to me that they made another tape about 4 miles from here. If anything, they say that one is even more remarkable. On that occasion, voices were recorded. Sitting here alone in the pub, it is tempting to believe that somehow these are voices and noises from the past, somehow recorded in the present. Certainly that's what some of the people here believe. I can make out the voices, but if they're speaking English, I have no idea what's being said. And if it's another language, I need to get a translation. Fortunately, the BBC has a unit which monitors foreign broadcasts. They've heard the recordings, and they say they can identify Arabic, but they're not sure what dialect or words are being used. But they say there's also a whole section in Russian, and there the voice is heard saying, and I quote, "We are very glad about the possibility of a meeting." But can the tapes themselves tell us anything? The Jolly Sailor recording was originally examined at the National Audio Forensic Lab in California by Norman Pearl. I've just spoken to Norman Pearl in the USA. He's a sound expert eminent in his field, but the Jolly Sailor tapes have mystified him. He says the audible words are at normal frequency, but his sensitive equipment has picked up a second conversation far outside the range of human speech. So while some of the voices are ordinary, others appear to be extraordinary. But could the sounds be easily created? I asked the BBC's radiophonic workshop if that was possible.
I can't make any definitive statements about them, but I can make one or two suggestions. I looked at the Prince of Wales tapes, which had all those strange sounds on, and to me it sounded very much like feedback, which is if you take the output of a tape machine and feed it back into the input, you get a similar sort of sound, which is something like this. And on the Jolly Sailor tapes, where you had the speech, the most obvious thing was that the speech was at the wrong speed. It was too slow. So what I did was take that speech and speed it up. What I found to my surprise was that the speed at which it worked was twice the original speed. Now, that makes me slightly suspicious, because if you're going to try and do this with simple equipment, you do it with a reel-to-reel tape machine, which has 2 speeds. The speeds are always in a ratio of 2. The other thing we can say about the speech is the frequencies involved. The lowest frequency in the speech was somewhere around 500 hertz, and the highest was somewhere around 5 kilohertz. Now, that's the frequency of a radio broadcast, say a shortwave radio broadcast.
That's one possible explanation, but what about our experiment back in Wales? Has that turned up anything? Good morning.
Morning, Chris.
Did you pick anything up?
We did, amazingly, yes. Just after 3 o'clock this morning, there were 2 sets of rapping noises in the room, quite interestingly different. The first set was picked up by both microphones. That's the one on the wall and the one in the room. Let's have a quick listen to those.
So that was recorded from the wall, almost like somebody banging against the wall.
It could, quite easily. But this second set of knockings is even more interesting. Now listen to this. This is just from the microphone in the room.
So that's a sound being made not from the wall but within the room itself?
Within the room itself, that's right.
Anybody that knows the history of this place, it used to be a courtroom upstairs, might say that that sounds like a judge's gavel crashing down. Can you be absolutely sure there's nobody up there?
Reasonably sure, yes, none of the sensors went off.
And what about the chances of it being caused by some everyday sound?
That is impossible. They're rather heavy noises. There were certainly small noises in the night, which I isolated to the central heating for one, and a constant little rattling from the time switch from John's experiment.
So you've eliminated those?
We've eliminated those, definitely.
Now, I asked you here, along with all this high-tech equipment, to try and shed some new light on this old mystery. How far do you think you've got?
Well, I think with the results we've got, we've only added further to the mystery. And in terms of any idea as to where the sounds have come from, I'm afraid I can add nothing to that whatsoever. Can I go to bed now?
You've seen and heard the evidence, but before you make up your mind, one more piece of information. The room where those recordings were made has been used for a club where people drink and play practical jokes. You might think that provides a solution to the mystery, but if the noise on our own carefully controlled tape was hoaxed, I'd love to know how it was done.
Have you ever had the feeling that someone is watching you, perhaps on a bus or a train, and then you turn round to find they really are? Although 80% of the population claim that this has happened to them, these experiences are usually dismissed as mere coincidence. But are they? Biologist Rupert Sheldrake has conducted his own experiments into the phenomenon to discover whether we really do have this special power.
As a biologist, I'm interested in the evolutionary origins of the sense of being stared at. I think one reason that it may have evolved is that if an animal knows when a predator is looking at it with evil intent, then it would be of great advantage to know that and perhaps to escape. Most people have experienced the sense of being looked at. Usually we dismiss it, it's trivial, but in life and death situations it can actually save people's lives.
Well, this was in 1950 in Malaya, where I was commanding a company of Gurkhas. And we were not quite sure whether something which we'd spotted was mist or smoke. If it was smoke, it meant that somebody was there who shouldn't have been there. So we crept around through the jungle, and we got it quite right. We arrived exactly in the camp, which was empty. So we thought, well, there's nobody here, that's it, we've failed. And we started looking through all the stuff to see if there was any information we might pick up, and while I was doing this, I suddenly felt, by God, somebody's looking at me. It was like a sort of magnet almost behind me. So I turned around, and there, in this long grass, about a cricket pitch away, was this chap wearing a cap with a red star on it. And of course, I identified him as being one of the terrorists. And he was just raising his rifle to shoot me. So I shot him before he shot me. I'm sure there's no doubt that on this particular day, it was some kind of sixth sense. And if it hadn't been for that sixth sense, I wouldn't be alive today, of course.
So Rupert claims that we all have this psychic ability, a kind of telepathy, not only to sense when we're being observed, but also to be able to prompt someone else to turn around to face us if we focus at the back of their heads.
Well, I find as I draw, and I draw a lot of people, I'm very interested in people, and I've found over the years that if I observe people in their natural setting for too long, they become very aware of being watched. Even if somebody's way outside a normal field of vision, that they're looking the other way, they may be having a conversation with someone else, they suddenly become aware. They start losing the soft, natural position they were in and become slightly uncomfortable. Maybe they scratch their head. They're sort of aware, that's all I can say really, and if they don't look round, they lose the pose. If they do look round, then we catch eyes, and then I sort of look the other way and try not to embarrass them or myself.
But are these common experiences just superstitious myths? For the first time, experiments have taken place in California to test this phenomenon.
We were interested in looking at the possibility that people's perception of being stared at from a distance is something that can't be explained by the known senses. So we monitored a specific parameter of their unconscious nervous system, what's called the autonomic nervous system. And we did that by putting sensors on the palm of their hand that would measure the sweat in their hand. This is the same kind of procedure that's used in a lie detector test, where you're attempting to get an unconscious reaction on the part of a participant.
At random times and repeated with many different people, one person would stare at another via a closed-circuit television. The person being stared at had no idea when this was happening. But the results seemed to indicate that unconsciously they did know, because their nervous system reacted during these times.
So these data suggest that, in fact, there is some kind of subtle information transfer that takes place between two people that isn't explained via the 5 conventional known senses.
In most experiments so far, people have known they're taking part in an experiment. A better kind of experiment, because it's closer to real life, is to have a situation where people don't know when they're being looked at. And that kind of experiment can reveal much more about this phenomenon in its natural setting.
Tonight we're going to help Rupert Sheldrake carry out his experiment here at Television Centre to test if people really do have this kind of sixth sense. In an hour's time, a studio audience for an entirely different programme will enter the building. The audience will come along a couple of corridors and then they'll begin to queue on these stairs as they wait to go in to Studio 8. Now, naturally, their backs will be facing a piece of darkened glass behind which are Rupert and his assistants. Now, they'll be staring intently at various members of the audience in the queue. Obviously, you can see them at the moment, but if we switch the lights off, they become invisible.
We'll have 1-minute periods when we look and 1-minute periods when we don't look. The point is to compare whether people turn around more when we're looking than when we're not looking.
Okay, team. Begin to stare.
We're not all going to look at the same person.
Generally, how pleased have you been? Obviously, you have to analyse the results, but how pleased are you with the experiment?
Well, I think it's quite good. I mean, we had some people who really did seem to turn around in response to our looking. In fact, this woman here, she looked as if she was slightly nervous, and significantly she was on her own. People who are busy talking to somebody else or with a friend don't react much, I've found, in these situations. But before she turned round, it was interesting, she was touching the back of her head, and she obviously felt nervous and probably slightly vulnerable.
When we interviewed people who'd turned around, none of them said they were conscious of being stared at.
I'm not surprised people said they weren't conscious of being looked at. This is largely an unconscious response. It only becomes conscious when you make eye contact. And the people doing the looking were hidden in this case, so that never happened. Over the last few weeks, I've been looking at these results in detail, and they've been evaluated by 3 people working blind, in other words, who didn't know when we were looking and when we weren't looking. The results show that 27 people turned round when we were looking, and 12 people turned round when we weren't looking, and this difference is statistically significant. Obviously, this experiment needs to be repeated, but the results of this first experiment are very encouraging indeed.
Rupert would like you to help him with future research into staring. He's designed a simple experiment taken from his book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World. We've put the details onto a fact sheet, and if you'd like a copy, please send a stamped addressed envelope to this address. Out of This World, room 4430B, BBC White City, 201 Wood Lane, London W12 7TS. Since the early 60s, we've become familiar with stories of people who say they've seen something unidentifiable in our skies, and subsequently, either through dreams or through hypnosis, believe they've been abducted by aliens. Now, if the victim was alone and there's no other evidence, it's easy to dismiss such cases. But if two people report identical experiences and other witnesses can support their account, what then? This story is told to us by Carol and her daughter Helen.
I was in the bathroom at 5:35 a.m. I looked out the window, which was only half open, and saw a brilliant blue-white light.
I too saw this light from my bedroom window. I sat on the edge of the bed waiting for an explosion, but nothing happened.
Tired? What time are you coming in last night? It was late. What have you got on today then? You've got much to do?
No, probably got a lot of orders to get out.
Yeah. It's a bit busy now, isn't it? It's a round object, solid object. It was a creamy white, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it was sort of on the side. It's sort of got like a bit cut out, and it, just a sort of a tiny thing sticking out at the end of it, and because it had this light coming from it,
and that was very bright. And I thought, well, that's no helicopter or plane. You know, I thought it's a UFO. I remember just staying up, looking at it, and thought, you know, it's just amazing what we'd seen.
Just barely seconds, it seemed to be on us. And then next week we sort of this beam of light went back up into this smoke effect thing, and we sort of stood here, just aghast.
Well, I've known Carol and Helen ever since I've been here. That's nearly 11 years, and I've never known them to be late at all. Never.
Well, we walked up to work and we always waved to the security guard, and we always checked to see what time it is.
When they arrive, I have to log them in on my duty, anybody that comes in fact, and they were over an hour late when I logged them in, so I noticed the time specifically, like.
All right, John. When we looked that morning, there was no clock on that wall, none at all.
None at all. It was completely bare.
Maybe they're having it fixed then.
Well, this clock that's behind me, it's a master clock for all the factory. It's been here for donkey's years, even before I started work. And they swore this clock just wasn't there when they arrived.
Well, they came home in the morning, I just got up myself. They come in, they was visibly shocked about something, and asked them what was the matter. And they reckon they'd seen something. They couldn't quite explain what they'd seen.
They just seemed that shocked and said, explain, they've seen something. And we said, what have you seen? They're just something in the sky. And then they later said, we think it was a UFO.
And they've also, they appeared to have a glow about it, and they've seen slightly burn up, say radiation burning.
All the hair was wet, and Ellen's coat was wet, wasn't it? And I said, what's your face? Your face is all pink.
Sunburn.
And then you looked down at their hands, all the parts of the body that wasn't covered was just like a very slight sunburn.
Yeah, well, when we come into the house, we were sort of excited telling everybody all about it, and that's when I sort of thought, fingers look sort of red, and as the day wore on, they sort of got redder. And then I looked at my neck, and I could see sort of a V sort of like all coloured in from there to there where the neck had been. And my hair, it was just sort of really tacky and, you know, sort of like I got loads of lacquer and I'd backcombed it. It just felt, you know, really sort of, really funny. And I couldn't really run my fingers through it. It was sort of all bitter. And then you said about your jacket.
Yeah. Well, I noticed that my jacket was wet and very sticky. It's the jacket I had on. And it was all across the back part and the shoulders, sort of like, as if it had been melted, like melting. It was very sticky and like on my arms. And yet that morning it wasn't raining at all. It was just a very clear morning.
So I said to my sister and my mother, well, try drawing what you've seen. And try drawing in a separate room. And see what happens. They both did. Come back exactly the same thing. They drew practically the same thing. That was the most astonishing thing.
This is what we saw. It's sort of a round object.
The spaceship, what we're seeing, was sort of like rounded.
It was sort of going flat, more or less to the top of it, with this sort of a thing just.
You know, sort of like a bit missing.
And then there was a beam of light which come all the way down.
A torch shining.
And we sort of held each other in this beam of light.
I was standing here, and my mum was on the other side of me there, and we sort of held each other.
Got it back into the moon.
They know something very, very strange had happened to them going to work, but it was something they couldn't account for, and of course it went into the back of their minds. Until one day they actually saw a newspaper article which referred to the alien abduction phenomenon, and they found that the things written in this newspaper were almost identical to what had occurred with them. As a result of this, they contacted me and told me what had occurred, what they remembered, and I interviewed them at length on this, and I was fairly happy in my own mind by what they told me. Things they couldn't possibly have known, that there seemed to be an alien abduction involved.
We was really nervous. In fact, we was really frightened of doing this regression. We heard so many strange stories, didn't we? I felt so emotional to think I was literally going up, and then next minute I was sort of in this spacecraft, and it's just I couldn't believe it myself, and I was thinking, I'm there. This small, about 3 feet to 4.
Regression is a form of hypnosis where you go back in time so that an individual has had an experience in the past which they maybe have forgotten for whatever reason. You take them back to the time, and regressive hypnosis can actually bring back the memories of the things that have been forgotten. Tell me about the room.
It's white. It's so white. It's like it's round. I can see Helen. She's on a board. It's shaped like a table, like a school table. There's something on the ceiling. It looks like operating something which will come down. My eyes, they're looking into my eyes. It feels like a burning sensation in my eye. They look like grey people. I think more white than there was grey, like, and they're big almond eyes, very big, and you can hardly see a nose, but you know a nose was there, and a mouth. And sometimes the mouth was not there. And other times, you knew there's sort of a line. In fact, sometimes you can see like a only tiny red line there.
He's touching my face, touching my hair now, looking at my heart. They're looking at my eyes.
What basically is happening is people are being examined medically. They're having toenails removed, they're having hair removed, they're having skin samples removed. I think what impressed me most about this case is the fact that when they were under hypnosis at separate times, the stories, the graphic descriptions, the things that were done to them were absolutely identical. What they did to one person, they did to another person.
His skin feels wet. He's put his hand on my face. My face feels wet. It's cold. I'm in a dark room now. I've got my clothes on and my jacket. I call out then for my mum.
I'm happy I saw that UFO in the morning and sort of seeing that. It's just so fantastic. But I thought of being abducted. In a way, I wish it hadn't happened, and I wish it wasn't us. Because people tend to think, yeah, she's, mad or...
Some people do think we're mad. We've heard people, you know, you hear them say it, but we know we're not mad. We both was together that day and we know what we saw.
So is there a conventional scientific explanation for what happened to Carol and Helen that morning? Dr. Richard Wiseman, a psychologist who specialises in the paranormal, went to see them.
Over the past few years, I've investigated several cases where people claim to have seen UFOs and been abducted by aliens. Many of these cases just involve one witness, and it's possible this person is lying, mistaken, or unreliable. What's impressive about this case is that not only does it involve Helen and Carol, but also several other locals who saw exactly the same phenomena.
I looked out the window and saw a brilliant blue-white
I
light.
too saw this light from my bedroom window.
Could it have been a searchlight from a helicopter maybe quite a way up? I mean, we are on the flight path here.
No, definitely not. Because there's no noise, and we regularly hear helicopters, and they're very noisy.
Yeah.
There's just no noise whatsoever.
We have quite a lot of police helicopters around here searching for the kids and that, and it's nothing like that.
It's simply because it was too, there was no noise.
It's too bright as well.
There was no noise and it just looked like the moon. I'd never seen an helicopter shaped as the moon before.
So exactly where did the light come from?
Come from directly above. I think it was higher than the flat, and it just comes straight down from above onto us both.
With some of the physical effects, the burns and the headaches and the nosebleeds, I wonder whether just the stress of seeing the light could have brought some of those on. Do you think they were just stress-related?
I don't think so, because we weren't stressed about it, because we thought it was so marvellous what we had saw. We just thought, look what we've saw. We've actually saw a UFO. And, I mean, we didn't even think of anything as being took away or anything. We just thought we just saw this bright light, and then we went to work.
This is where Helen and Carol work. When they arrived, they said they couldn't see the clock on the wall and had lost an hour of time. I think their earlier experience in the alleyway had left them confused and dazed. One of the impressive aspects of the case is that under aggression, you both came out with very similar stories. Do you think that maybe you discussed the case together before you regressed, or you'd read the same books or read the same articles, and that's why your stories were so similar?
No, because we didn't think we was...
Before we was going to be regressed, we was like, both very frightened about being regressed. And we didn't know what sorts of things you would probably see in the spaceship or anything like that. And, you know, so we wouldn't know what to talk about together, about saying what tests they'd done or anything, because we didn't know, anything really about abductions then. We've read a lot about UFOs, but not abduction cases.
Plus we thought, because when we were at the alleyway, we heard a rustling sound before this bright light come, so we thought we was going to be regressed to think that we saw something in the alleyway, what we shouldn't have saw. So we thought, well, I wonder what we did see. Was it going to be a green man or something really frightening? Will it frighten us? So the spaceship or anything like that I didn't even think about it.
We didn't think that would have been took up there.
No.
Now, some people think that hypnosis is a way of finding out true facts. Other people think that it gives people a sort of license just to fantasize and make things up. Did it feel, when you were saying these things, like a real memory, or did it feel like you might have been making them up?
No, I felt quite emotional really when you're sort of looking around the room and then you see like a sort of a grey being come to you. Sort of felt quite emotional. It was sort of like a bit of a shock, but yet sort of weren't so much frightened, just emotional.
And to think that had happened to you, you'd had them sort of tests done on you, that was sort of like frightening. To think that they could just take you and sort of do tests like that on you without you having to, asking you first.
And it is quite a sort of fantastic sort of account in many ways. Do you really believe that this really did happen and that you were abducted by aliens aboard a spaceship?
Well, I don't think I'd want to make a story up like that, because I feel silly enough by saying it, so I don't think I would have said nothing has happened, because I would want to look stupid.
I think sometimes you feel a bit sort of, is it true, or, under hypnosis, is it happening to him? But I think you sort of think like that because you're frightened of what people might say when you do tell them, I've seen an alien, they might think, oh, she's a bit mad. I think that puts you off with you believing it fully because you're frightened of what people might think of you.
I found Helen and Carol very open and friendly, and I'm convinced they saw something that night and that it had a traumatic effect on them. But I also believe that they were caught in the beam of a helicopter searchlight, and that the other events were the result of this rather unusual experience. But nonetheless, There are some aspects of the case, like the stickiness on the jacket and on the hair, which remain very difficult to explain.
Whatever happened that morning certainly had an enormous effect on their lives, particularly Carol, who felt a strong need for change. She ended her 25-year marriage and began an educational course. Finally, have you ever thought you've caught a glimpse of someone you know, only to discover later that they were never there? You'd probably put it down to a case of mistaken identity. But what would you do if the person you came face to face with was yourself?
About 5 years ago, I was a security patrol driver for a company based just outside Bournemouth. It was my job to travel around various sites during the course of the night, check the security of them, windows, doors, and obviously all the locks. I was driving down the A351 towards Wareham, the same road that I'd driven down for at least 4 to 5 months at exactly the same time. On this particular night, I was running approximately 15 minutes late. As I approached the roundabout, I slowed right down to a crawl because I could see another vehicle approaching on the opposite side of the road. It was almost an exact copy of the vehicle that I was driving. The lettering on the side of the vehicle was exactly the same as the lettering on the side of mine. But more incredibly, the other driver who was glancing at me was in fact me. I was stunned. The next 10 minutes of the journey I was in turmoil. I just couldn't believe what I'd seen. I'd seen another me. And it wasn't as if it was just like a likeness. It was a carbon copy, a mirror image. And I was very frightened. The strangest part of this incident for me was the fact that the other vehicle was at the same point on the road that I would have been had I not been late that night. People persist in saying that I must have been mistaken. All I can say to them is, surely you recognise yourself when you look into the mirror.
Adrian says it was late at night and he was tired. Perhaps he imagined it. Or could he have a double driving a similar van on a similar route at a similar time of night? Join me next week when we'll be trying to find out if our pets really can read our minds. And Chris will be speaking to the British Airways pilot who saw an unidentified flying object. Good night.